Representations of the natural world date back centuries. The caves at Lascaux, France are one of the oldest pictorial examples of landscape drawing. According to written sources by Vitruvius, landscapes were an established form of painting in Rome by the year 30 BC. And long before landscape became a genre in its own right in the West, landscape art was well established in China, originating from the 6th century. The most common form of Chinese landscape, inspired by the philosophical tradition of Taoism, is called shan shui. This type of landscape is executed to represent the idea that shan shui painting is not an open window to the viewer's eye, it is an object for the viewer's mind. In other words, it is not simply a representation of what is seen, but that which fits the genre's spiritual and theoretical requirements. While landscape varies dramatically from artist to artist and from era to era, the Chinese example illustrates what these wildly different depictions of the natural world have in common. As Roger Benjamin has argued, landscape is a scheme of representation, an artifice that is entangled in a forest of codes, whose point of reference is quite often less the thing represented, the geographical site, than a series of painterly protocols provided by contemporary or previous practitioners of the genre. In other words, like all works of art, landscape, even the most naturalistic example, is a representation, subject to the artist's staging. In the history of art, landscape has only recently been recognized as a legitimate genre. During the Renaissance, landscape was a backdrop for biblical, historical, and mythological stories. Technical advances were made in perspective and proportion that revolutionized the way scenery was depicted. In the 16th century, landscape was officially recognized as an independent genre, although it was considered to be of low significance. In the 17th century, however, landscape began to flourish, particularly in the new Dutch Republic and in France. Because there was an open market for art in the Netherlands, genres such as still lifes and landscape were in demand, even if they did not reach the prestige of history painting. According to scholar Cynthia Schneider, although contemporary appreciation for landscape may reflect most directly the impact of the Impressionists of the late 19th century, its foundation was laid by the Dutch of the 17th century. Rembrandt van Rijn, although primarily a history painter, was one of the masters of the landscape genre in his prints and drawings. He only executed 8 landscape paintings throughout his career. Landscape with the Stone Bridge is a rare example from 1638. In his etching Landscape with a Cow from 1650, the artist transplants a Dutch farmhouse into an imaginary mountainous setting. In this posthumous state of the etching, the craggy mountains on the left-hand side are difficult to see. In the first state, however, the mountain rears up to the left and the farmhouse seems to lean into it. While Dutch artists were known for their close observation of nature, their paintings and other works were the result of a careful process of selection, modification, and combination of motifs. Landscape with a Cow is what scholar Schneider calls Rembrandt's imaginary landscapes, which date from the late 1640s to the early 1650s. She goes on to say that the artist invented not only the rough terrain in the background of the print, but also the trees and stream, creating a new, partially Dutch, partially imaginary environment for the farmhouse. In the process, he so successfully integrated the realistic and fantastic elements that one looks twice before realizing how improbable a scene it is. The farmhouse fits comfortably into the shadow of the cliff, which is treated by Rembrandt as if it were a commonplace on the Dutch boulder. Dutch artists were noted for their powers of observation in creating naturalistic-looking landscapes. Dutch Canal is an original oil painting executed around 1650 by an artist in the circle of Dutch Golden Age painter Eric van der Neer. The painting depicts a canal landscape dotted with figures and houses. A well-dressed couple walks in the marshy foreground. The figure behind them appears to be working. Another couple stands before an arch, and a boatman is navigating the placid waters of the canal. The left side of the picture is dominated by mature trees. The painting is similar to a work with full attribution to Vandermeer at the Metropolitan Museum of Art entitled Landscape at Sunset. Vandermeer himself, however, was a master of nocturnal atmospheric effects of light and sky, as seen in Landscape at Sunset, but Dutch Canal, unlike the attributed Vandermeer's, portrays a placid blue daylight sky with patchy clouds. Nevertheless, Dutch Canal, with its careful attention to detail and realism, portrays a distinctly Dutch mode of ordering the landscape. According to Peter Sutton, as no other people before them, the Dutch in the 17th century compiled a remarkably comprehensive record in paint of their land, people, and possessions. What 19th century art historians like Eugène Fromentin call the probity of Dutch art, its record of fact and compelling truth to life, was perhaps more clearly expressed in landscape than in any other genre. The Dutch, for all intents and purposes, invented the naturalistic landscape. Yet for all its inventory of fact and observation, Dutch landscape was neither a literal speculum naturae, mirror of reality, nor a topographically exact traveler's journal. The Dutchman's painterly imagination reformed nature. We no longer rest easy with uncomplicated notions of a naive Dutch realism chronicling the countryside with the literalness of a camera lens. Nor can we accept the view of Dutch landscape as a portrait of the land, unless one acknowledges the portraitist's license to editorialize, recast, and flatter. Thus, despite the seemingly true-to-life naturalism of the Dutch landscape, Netherlandish artists reordered the landscape, aiming to fool and delight the eye. As artist Samuel van Hoogstraten said, painting should be an image inspired by natural observation, but altered and embellished so that it deceives in an acceptable, pleasing, and praiseworthy way. Claude Lorraine, a French contemporary of Rembrandt working in Rome in the 17th century, was another great landscape artist. Like Rembrandt, most of Claude's paintings are history paintings with figures which represent a biblical or mythological scene. For example, the seascape with figures representing a moment in Greek mythology in the Metropolitan Museum of Art, the Trojan women setting fire to their fleet from 1643. His drawings and etchings, like Rembrandt, focus on his construction of the natural world. Joachim van Sandrart, German artist and one of Claude's biographers, described the artist's working methods for capturing the essence of nature. He wrote that Claude studied his art with great seriousness and application. He tried by every means to penetrate nature, lying in the fields before the break of day and until night, in order to learn to represent very exactly the red morning sky, sunrise and sunset, and the evening hours. When he had well contemplated one or the other in the fields, he immediately prepared his colors accordingly, returned home and applied them to the work he had in mind with much greater naturalness than anyone had ever done. Claude and his contemporary Nicolas Poussin were lauded for their classical landscapes that stressed balance and harmony as opposed to verisimilitude to a particular locale. The 18th century poet and philosopher Goethe stated, "The pictures are true, yet have no trace of actuality." Claude Lorraine knew the real world by heart, down to the minutest details, but he used it only as a means of expression, the world of his beautiful soul. And this precisely is true ideality, to avail oneself of realistic means to reveal the true in such a way that it creates an illusion of being the real. Claude made only 44 prints, but they tell us much about his artistic relationship to nature. His earliest dated etching of 1637 is The Tempest, an image that depicts a storm-tossed sea with ships on the verge of capsizing. The theme of ships in a storm was popular in the 17th century, and Claude presents a realistic, albeit dramatic-looking scene. On the lower right-hand side of the etching, 3 figures depart from the shore, attempting to keep their small craft afloat. Despite the dark and turbulent waves, in this state of the etching, the work seems to indicate that the storm may be at its end, as the artist has created a lightness in the sky on the left-hand side. On the right, Claude renders a wooded shoreline and a ruin behind a group of bobbing ships. Despite the turmoil depicted, the formal elements of the scene are laid out with balance and harmony. Another more powerful example of Claude's staging of landscape in a classical manner is an etching done in 1662 after Poussin's painting of 1624 to 1636, Dance to the Music of Time, entitled Time, Apollo, and the Seasons. As in his paintings, the print foregrounds the activities of the mythological figures to depict a scene that highlights the theme of transience. The figures disport themselves within an idealized landscape setting. The 19th century critics and academicians who revered Claude and Poussin as the source for all precepts of style and landscape called this type of landscape a paysage composé, or composed landscape. Martin Sonneman points out that to achieve balance, rhythm, and overall harmony inevitably meant to depart from the natural model and replace it with an ideal invention. In Claude's work, we can observe how consistently he uses the same building blocks: the lone tree, the tower, the antique edifice, the distant mountains, for example. The act of composition in Claude's art consisted in assembling these components in new and ever different ways. Marianne Bizance-Procken has suggested that Rembrandt's dramatic print, The Three Trees of 1643, may have been influenced by Claude, whose prints had been circulated since 1630. The etching is one of the most famous landscapes, is this okay? Mm-hmm. In the history of Western European art. The scene is the subject of many theories about its symbolism. For example, speculations about the role of the three trees and their associations with the three. Excuse me. The scene is the subject of many theories about its symbolism, for example, speculations about the role of the three trees and their associations with the three crosses on Golgotha. She continues, it is an imaginary panoramic landscape in which the city seen on the horizon is only broadly reminiscent of Amsterdam. On one hand, the print offers a breathtaking impression of a landscape defined by depth and atmosphere. The finely contoured layers of space brighten increasingly with proximity to the horizon. On the other hand, the dark masses of clouds, penetrating rays of light, and the three trees create an unreal, dramatic atmosphere that dominates the image. The towering silhouetted trees contrast emphatically with the bright sky behind them. She speculates that it may have been Rembrandt's intention to create this imaginary landscape, a Netherlandish counterpart to the southern, idealized type of landscape seen in the etchings of Claude Lorraine. Thus, the observational mode of the Dutch and the classical mode of the artist working in Italy meet the staged landscapes of Rembrandt and Claude in the 17th century. Despite its low status in the hierarchy of genres that persisted into the 18th century, by the end of the century, landscape nevertheless had become increasingly popular. Its ubiquity and prevalence in part reflected an artistic response to rapid urbanization and the Industrial Revolution. The 19th century is known as the golden age of landscape. The beginning of the century saw the rise of the Romantics. This group of artists represented nature as a manifestation of an interior stage rather than a faithful depiction of topography. In the late 18th century, landscape was divided into three categories: the pastoral, the picturesque, and the sublime. Pastoral celebrated the domain of mankind over nature. The British artist John Constable represents the pastoral in his painting from 1821, The Hay Wain, which features three horses pulling a wood wain across the river. Another important 19th century artist who represented the pastoral was Jean-Baptiste Camille Corot. Educated in the classical manner at the Académie Française, he was also a proponent of plein air painting. He was favored by academic critics of his day for his reconciliation of exactitude and style, observation and imagination, and north and south. According to Benjamin, Corot's pictures exemplify a staging of the natural that could both produce the illusion of truth to nature and yet please a critic by their decorative tracery of tonal and melodic ensembles. The picturesque showcases the beauty and wildness of natural scenery, unspoiled by human intervention and urbanization. John Thomas Smith's etching, Trees at the Edge of a Pond, from 1793 is an example of the picturesque. The miniature work is an intimate picture of pristine scenery. The tree on the left-hand side of the picture is partially damaged, perhaps due to a storm, a detail that enhances the picturesque nature of the setting. Also, the scene does not appear to be composed or framed within the etching. The trees are staged to be natural and are cut off at the edges of the frame. Smith's attention to detail is also shown in the reflection of the trees in the pond. This is not an idealized vision of nature imbued with the spirit of the classical past. Rather, it is an individualized and personal vision of the natural world. The sublime, as articulated by the philosopher Edmund Burke in his philosophical inquiry into the origin of ideas of the sublime and the beautiful in 1757, refers to the thrill and danger of confronting untamed nature and its overwhelming forces. The sublime is a humbling reminder that humanity is not all-powerful. Sublime images show nature at its most fearsome. Burke believed that terror is, in all cases, the ruling principle of the sublime. The Romantic painter, Caspar David Friedrich's painting Monk by the Sea of 1808 to 1810, is an example of the representation of the sublime. The lone monk stands on the shore, small and powerless, as the sea rages in front of him. The painting can be seen as uplifting, but in a deeply spiritual way. The sublime emphasizes God's dominion over humanity. In 1840, English artist J.M.W. Turner represented the sublime in Slave Ship, slavers throwing overboard the dead and dying, typhoon coming on. The work is an example of the artist's fascination with violence, both human and elemental. According to the Museum of Fine Arts, Boston, who owns the work, Turner based the painting on an 18th century poem that described a slave ship caught in a typhoon and on the true story of the Zong, a British ship whose captain, in 1781, had thrown overboard sick and dying enslaved people so that he could collect insurance money only available for those, quote, lost at sea. The painting is a horrifying depiction of the sublime, as it reveals man at his worst, as well as the terrifying power of nature. In the 19th century, French artists traveled to the environs around Paris to paint nature and plein air. A group of artists known as the Barbizon School left the city in search of unspoiled landscapes. The forest at Fontainebleau in 1849, a mere train ride from Paris, was the preferred location for these artists. According to Stephen Adams, some of the artists associated with the district were known for the meticulous finish of their works, while others had a reputation for daring, impulsive handling of paint. Some artists painted wild, uninhabited landscapes, while others painted scenes from peasant life. Painting from this area is conspicuous for its diversity, and art critics often struggle to find meaningful labels to describe the new styles of naturalistic painting that emerged in France in the early 1830s. Those artists responsible for the first setting out, followed by Monet and his contemporaries, had, however, one thing in common: their interest in native rural imagery, and this is one of the defining features of the informal federation of landscape painters that in the late 19th century came to be called the Barbizon School. The 1820s saw the rising popularity of landscape among the French middle class, as well as the taste for 17th century Dutch and Flemish landscape. And Adams continues, by the mid-1830s, left-wing and liberal artists and critics saw historical landscape painting based on classical ideals as outmoded. By the 1850s, the forest of Fontainebleau was an analogy for nature itself, serving as one of the principal sites earmarked for an experience of the natural world. Charles-François d'Aubigny, a landscape painter who was associated with the Barbizon School, worked as a printmaker, producing graphic illustrations and designs for the rapidly expanding print industry. In the 30s and 40s, that is 1830s and 40s, the artist made numerous wood and steel engravings to illustrate travel guides, editions of poetry, popular songs, and novels. The artist made an etching entitled La Realisma of himself painting in plein air on his boat, a floating studio. Like many artists before him, Daubigny used printmaking as a means of promoting his career. Magazines published Daubigny's print work. According to Adams, the artist made landscape engravings for reproduction in art magazines to promote his landscape paintings on show at the Salon, and also created landscape etchings as works of art in their own right. Interestingly, Adams writes, conventions in printmaking began to determine the appearance of landscape painting. Daubigny's etchings from around 1865 is an example of the Barbizon painter's preoccupations. Entitled Les Mendages, the work depicts peasants bringing in the harvest. The central image shows a figure gathering the crop into baskets. In the center of the image, placid cows congregate around the baskets. In the right middle ground, another worker is harvesting the crop. This is a pastoral image of country life in which the workers and livestock are in peaceful communion with the land. After the 1848 revolution in France, however, the depiction of peasants took on a different form from their representation as part of picturesque country life. Artists like Gustave Courbet and Jean-Francois Millet's pictures of peasants as the main subject were seen by conservative critics not only as aesthetic willfulness, but also as political provocation. It is unlikely that Daubigny's etching, however, which seems to be printed for mass consumption, was aligned with Courbet and Millet's political aims in the depiction of rural life. A tribute to the circle of Theodore Rousseau, Forest of Fontainebleau, Treetop, demonstrates the representation of the forest by a member of the Barbizon school. Rousseau was considered by many mid-19th century art critics to be the leader of the new naturalistic school of French landscape painting. The artist put into practice technical innovations that contribute to the developing importance of plein air painting. The painter began visiting the area in 1827 and lived in the village of Barbizon from 1836. There he was joined by his disciples Jules Dupré and Narcisse Diaz de la Peña. According to Anthea Callan, avant-garde painters sought the authenticity that was associated with the direct and spontaneous painting technique, as opposed to the léché, licked or highly polished finish associated with official academic painting. Even when a painting might in fact be carefully premeditated, the concern of the avant-garde painter was for the appearance of immediacy. Forest of Fontainebleau exhibits rough, visible brushstrokes, conveying both the appearance of the treetops and the immediacy of observed effects such as the sky and the sun. The perspective the painter employs is that of looking at the treetops at their level, which shows the forest as lush and unspoiled. Callan writes, the oil study, of which Forest of Fontainebleau is an example, required speed of execution to capture ephemeral effects that signified truth. Just as individual authenticity, truth and sincerity, came to be more and more highly valued during the 19th century, so too the painting etude, or study, gained in prestige. Callan points out that landscape painting in general, and the plein air oil study in particular, were key drivers of change in artistic practice in the 19th century, which culminated in Impressionism and Post-Impressionism. The redefinition of status of landscape painting is the Barbizon school's legacy. Like the Barbizon artists, Impressionists like Claude Monet employed the oil sketch to represent the immediacy of changing light and atmospheric conditions. Monet's 1872 Impression Sunrise gave the Impressionist movement its name. The painting depicts the harbor at Le Havre with the sun rising in the distance. Notably, Monet chose to represent industry at Le Havre's port, a departure from the Barbizon School emphasis on unspoiled landscapes. The work is abstracted. There is an illusion of the subject, boats, ships, and smokestacks, and the brushstrokes that define them. American artists such as Mary Cassatt, Theodore Robinson, Chill Tassam, William Merritt Chase, and John Singer Sargent were influenced by the work of the Impressionists, and they began to paint in an Impressionist mode around 1880. Francesco Spicuzza, born in Sicily and immigrated to Wisconsin, shows the impact of Impressionism in his landscapes from around 1930, Lake Michigan Shore and Rocky Shore. Lake Michigan Shore is almost entirely abstract. The blue paint on the work's upper half indicates the blue water of the lake, while the green and clay-colored paint on the painting's lower half signifies the shore and its vegetation. The line between the land and the water is unclear, perhaps except for the white, blue, and purple horizontal brushstroke from the mid-right-hand side of the painting. In Rocky Shore, land and water are more clearly demarcated. However, Spicuzza emphasizes the brushstrokes, which, like Monet's water lily, elides paint and subject. The works become abstracted marks on a canvas, like Monet's monumental and panoramic reflection of clouds on the water lily pond from around 1920, flattening the picture plane and calling attention to the work's materials. Its reference to the mode of representation itself, almost as much as its subject matter. The work of contemporary artist Daniel Kluwer exhibits some similarities to the late Monet landscapes. Time augments a belief from 2020 is what the artist calls a botanical abstraction. In this work, Kluwer painted the composition, in this case flowers and foliage, and then repeatedly scraped over the canvas, moving paint to the edges, removing the original gesture, and adding a non-painterly texture produced by the scraping tool. Using this technique, the artist blurs and distorts the original image, leaving only a trace of the artist's hand. The result is an abstracted pattern suggestive of plant life. When Kluwer and Monet's compositions while they share visual similarities, their methods are quite different. Monet's late work foregrounds the artist's gesture, while Kluwer's method erases it, leaving a ghostly vestige of the original subject. The enigmatic title serves to further remove the painting from the realm of the representational. According to James Rubin, although we now take for granted the practice of painting on the spot directly from observation, in the 19th century it was controversial. It was inseparable from the issue of the role of modern subjects of art, and it was pejoratively compared to photography, which was considered a mechanical and commercial, hence non-creative pursuit. While opinions of photography and Impressionism, for that matter, have changed, some ideas about the unmediated nature of the photographic medium still persist, particularly with landscape photography. We must dispel the myth of simple point and shoot in photography, especially in the 20th and 21st centuries. Photography, like works in other mediums, is the result of many aesthetic and technical choices. Consider, for instance, Bridal Bell Fall in Yosemite from 1958 by Thomas Furtivar. This picture was taken when the photographer was a student in Ansel Adams' workshop at Yosemite National Park in Northern California. And we have it in Adams on the right there. The majestic image depicts the face of the mountain from which the Bridal Veil waterfall flows. The trees in the foreground are dwarfed by the sheer sides of the mountain. The photographer achieves a stunning level of detail by exploiting a wide tonal range in the shot. The resulting work shares characteristics of Adams' photos. As Nye writes of Adams' photography, and this is also true of Furtivar's, while modern film technology gave him the option of making a great many exposures, he rejected this approach to image making, insisted on patiently studying a scene and waiting for the right moment to make an exposure when the lighting composition appeared to him ideal. What precisely constituted this ideal? In his crisp photographs, the world seemed to be new, untouched, luminous, even Edenic. Adams' images, both in the self-consciously old-fashioned manner of their making and their appearance, appealed on the basis of an apparent fidelity to nature, which is to say a putative fidelity to what the natural world was like before modern civilization intruded. In this image and its construction, Vertigar presents a sublime landscape, massive, lush, and pure, and apparently unspoiled by civilization. The landscape photograph, The Spirit of John Muir with Star Trails, Yosemite, from 2001 by Robert Kuwika-Shear, is mediated by the body of the artist, which adds a performative aspect to the work. The picture depicts a clearing in a pine forest. A kind of altar appears at the center of the photograph, perhaps an homage to John Muir. A felled branch lays atop boulders, producing a tent-like silhouette. A spectral shadow is cast on the rocks. Star trails streak through the night sky. Using a 4x5 camera, Shear achieves the effects of presence and of the passage of time captured in a single image by using a long single exposure lasting from 45 minutes to 7 hours. After the photographer opens the shutter of the camera, he enters the frame of the picture, becoming a performer in the scene. Because he is using low-intensity moonlight to illuminate the night, Shear can enter the camera's view without the negative recording his movement. In this work, the artist can be seen casting a shadow on the rocks underneath a wooden tent. I can point that out because it's a little hard to see in this. But here it is. Through its ghostly image, which the artist calls a spirit shadow, Shear performs the spirit of John Muir in the natural setting of Yosemite, befitting the conservationist and environmental activists who fought to make Yosemite a national park. The star trails, formed by the long exposure of the film, track the passage of time and the movement of the earth. The Spirit of John Muir with Star Trails is a performative event, carefully staged for preservation in the future. Jesse Spy's Impressionisms of Milwaukee No. 2 from 2010 pushes the limits of photographic practice and speaks to the ways in which landscape engages time and memory. The image, blurred and almost flickering, depicts the cityscape of Milwaukee. The artist employs a multiple exposure technique that serves to break down the clarity of the image so that it's difficult to read. Because of its near illegibility, Impressions of Milwaukee defies a viewer's expectation of photography as an index of the thing photographed, as proof of its existence. At the same time, however, the city is still present, even as a specter. It is notable that Spies calls the work an impression, and that the photograph is printed on canvas, as its near abstraction is somehow painterly, recalling the work of the Impressionist painters of the oil sketch. Unlike the Impressionists, however, Spies' work engages multiple moments in time imprinted on a single canvas. According to the artist, her works at once diminish representational form and facilitate questions about memory and experience. Thus, rather than freezing a single image in time, the blurry impression suggests the work of time on memory. The photograph demonstrates the ways in which time affects the clarity with which the viewer remembers something. Unlike a single exposure photograph, Spies' work does not bring a clear picture of the past into the present. Rather, it problematizes the relationship between past and present by engaging the concept of memory. Other landscape artists have forayed into the realm of the fantastic. For example, Scooter Githorsian's landscapes are populated with fanciful creatures. In Sunday Afternoon at Scooter Inlet and Winter in Scooter Forest, both mixed media works on paper from 2011, The artist places cut-out, candy-colored figures in a photographed landscape. The juxtaposition of the naturalistic photographed landscapes and the invented two-dimensional figures takes away any sense of the photographs as indices of reality. The fact that the landscapes are ready-made, that is, cut out from an unknown source and repurposed for the work, removes them even further from reality. And this defamiliarization seems to be the artist's intent. We are left to speculate about a possible narrative for the works. Saturday Afternoon at Scooter Inlet may suggest a similarity to Georges Seurat's Sunday Afternoon on the island of the Grand Jatte, which shows people at leisure in a popular tourist locale outside of Paris in the 19th century. Gilthorian transforms this art historical reference, adding whimsy and humor. Two artists working in the Surrealist tradition, René Magritte and Juan Miró, also created unconventional and fantastic landscapes. Le Retour, or The Return by Magritte, and Maravillas con variaciones acrósticas en el Jardín de Miró, Wonders with acrostic variations in Miró's garden, represent imagined landscapes. Le Retour, a lithograph based on a 1940 painting by Magritte, depicts a bird whose body is made of the daytime sky, flying over a lush landscape in the nighttime sky. A nest with 3 eggs sits on the windowsill, which is the viewer's vantage point. The work simultaneously portrays night and day. The image of the bird as sky appears to be the embodiment of the sublime, associated with transcendence, with rising up, with apotheosis. In this bird, whose body is made of the day sky, the apotheosis seems all the more explicit. The bird is in a pool of light in the midst of the sky at night. As sky, it is a literal part of the landscape, and is a part of the paradox of the work. Instead of jolting the viewer into another understanding of the world, Magritte eases us into a new perception. The bird itself, with its body made of air, acts as a sort of window into the world of infinite possibilities. Miró's Maravillas is a whimsical, largely abstract landscape. The book, of which the images are a part, features 20 lithographs by Miró alongside poems dedicated to Miró by the famous Spanish poet Rafael Alberti. Miró's prints combine his love of nature with a playful abstraction, bringing to life a garden where little maravillas, wonders or marvels, exist among the butterflies and flowers. Giving equal importance to a bug, bird, and person, Miró depicts bodies represented and broken down into their most basic shape. This example, like the others in the book, displays abstract objects and figures in the garden landscape. The triangular image on the left could depict a tree, and it's worth noting that Miró is not a completely non-objective artist, but the surrealist doesn't make images clear enough to read with certainty. The work expresses childlike simplicity and wonder, while it is compositionally sophisticated. The artist guides the viewer, but allows him or her to enter the space of the garden with delight and wonder. Artists have also made analogies between the human body and the landscape, often using images of the female nude, producing an erotic landscape. Carl Summers, in his Madre, a lithographic print from 1980 made after his 1972 woodcut, elides the figure of the nude woman with the mountain range for which the work is named. It is worth noting that Sierra Madre is a feminine title, mirroring the feminization of the landscape. In this image, a nude woman lays splayed at the top of a red hill, the curves of her body echoing those of the landscape, becoming an image of woman as landscape. Artists such as Henri Matisse and René Magritte have represented women as part of nature as well. According to the art historian Roger Benjamin, the arabesque, which is a decorative motif that employs flower, foliage, or fruit, and sometimes animal and figural outlines to produce an intricate pattern of interlaced lines, was employed by Matisse to avoid hierarchic relationships between figure and ground in his paintings, rejecting a representational landscape. Without the primacy of the figure, the painting becomes a decorative or artificial surface. Benjamin argues that the decorative is exacerbated in the fauve landscape and that their organizing principle of the arabesque becomes paramount. He cites Matisse's Le Bonheur de Vivre from 1906 as an example of this staging of landscape by equating the female body with the landscape using the arabesque. He points out, here figures are outlined to excess, making of many a curve that is arabesque, signs for feminine sexuality in the elaboration of the scene whose erotic character is pronounced. René Magritte also represents the erotic landscape in Magie Noire, a posthumous lithograph from 2011. Magie Noire belongs to a group of paintings and prints the artist executed in the 1940s, an illusionistically rendered female nude in an unidentified landscape. The model for this work, is Magritte's wife, Georgette Berger. The figure is an idealized female nude leaning on a block of stone. Framed by a stone wall with a window opening out into the landscape, the subject looks out into the water and a cloud-filled sky. Her gaze is downcast and her eyes appear to be closed. Like a piece of classical sculpture, she's an object to be looked at. The female nude was the subject of surrealist interest. In this example, Magritte has created a fantasy or dream world that centers on the transformation of the female body into the landscape. The woman's bottom half is depicted in flesh tones, while her top half is blue, like the sea and sky behind her. The landscape is literally mapped onto her body. In her transformation, she becomes one with the landscape, like the women in Summers and Matisse's works. Magritte places sexuality and desire at the center of his work, with the nude female body as landscape, the passive object of the viewer's gaze. In this essay, I have attempted to present very different examples of landscape painting to demonstrate the ways in which artists have represented the natural world, a world that seems rife for naturalistic portrayals, but is nevertheless subject to the artist's unique interpretations. In closing, I would like to present briefly some more examples of the rendering of nature. John Stuart Curry, one of the three major practitioners of American regionalist painting with Grant Wood and Thomas Hart Benton, rejected European academicism and modernism and believed that art should appeal to the common man. In Sketching Wisconsin from 1946, Curry, dressed as coveralls, presents himself as a worker artist. Out of the studio, yet overseeing his wife, Kathleen Gould Curry, painting the landscape as well as surveying the landscape itself. In the foreground's triangular configuration, Curry occupies a dominant position, presenting himself as the ultimate master of the composition. In addition, the artist presents a picture within a picture, a device used by the old masters to show their painterly mastery. Robert Kipnis's landscape from around 1968 is an example of the artist's earliest lithographs, made exclusively in black and white. As in his paintings, the artist depicts trees and houses seen at varying distances in the field. There are no human figures in his work, and the dwellings are small, which contributes to the deserted quality of the composition. The use of subtle black and white tones creates an overall atmospheric effect of a ghostly town. Despite the lush grass, there is a spareness to the work, exacerbated by the central image of the nearly leafless tree. The lithograph has a quiet stillness, an almost haunting or uncanny quality akin to surrealism. Kipnis's works have been described as conveying solitude and inward experience. Some images of nature border on the abstract. Fred Reitman's painting In Advance of Spring from 1984 depicts a leafless tree colored yellow and blue on a pink ground. Its economy of means likens it to Pete Mondrian's flowering apple tree from 1912. Reitman, like Mondrian, avoids the suggestion of volume and radically simplifies the form of the tree so that it's difficult to discern what is being depicted. Neither tree is rooted by gravity. The tree is coming into being, as its title suggests. Both artists imbued nature with spirituality. According to Leah Ullman of the Los Angeles Times, Reichman's works are acts of reference for precise moments in time, confluences of light, color, awareness. Robert Richter, in his painting on wood, First Snow from 2003, uses a similar reductive palette and form in his representation of a winter landscape. Like Reichman, Richter uses flat fields of color that blur the lines between figuration and abstraction. First Snow, with its radical cropping of the tree on the left-hand side of the painting, recalls Japanese ukiyo-e woodblock prints. The scene from 20 Views of Tokyo displays a similar cropping of the snow-laden tree on the left to give a sense of immediacy that almost places the viewer inside the image. Patricia Tobacco Forrester's Red Zigzag from 2003 and Gregory D. Stone's Stone Skipper from 2009 display a remarkable level of detail, such that the viewer is lured into the painting's fiction. For example, Forrester's work looks naturalistic, and while she painted in plein air, she did not replicate a specific view. Instead, they are rearrangements of her surroundings, interwoven with her reminiscences. She was interested in inconsistencies and distortions, giving her floral landscapes a mannered quality. She has said that although she works directly from nature, flowers bloom where they should not deliberately to reinforce that this is a landscape of my mind. Similarly, Steele's Stone Skipper is at first glance a hyper-realistic image of a boy skipping stones on a Door County beach. But he, like Forrester, does not reproduce an exact scene. While the artist has said he combines realism and impressionism to draw the viewer into the space of the painting, the work is almost surrealist in its intention to the minutiae of the landscape. For example, the individual stones that fill the foreground and the lonely cabin in the background surrounded by stylized trees. It is only upon examining the painting at close range does one see the almost impressionistic brushstrokes that temper the realism of the work. Forster's and Steele's work are like the Dutch of the 17th century, realistic but imaginary landscapes. Tom Shelton's A Field for the Birds from 1991 presents an ordered landscape. A line of birds cuts diagonally across a canvas, facing a row of trees. Shadows cast by the trees create straight lines across the canvas. Despite the realistically painted scenes of species of birds and variegated colors of the trees in the forest, the artist creates a kind of grid that references modern minimalist painting. The grid maps the picture plane, presenting an all-over pattern. Shelton tweaks the minimalist aesthetic, however, by adding the representation elements of birds and the trees. The painting is at once a grid and a landscape. Another example of a mapping or ordering of landscape is Melody Legal's Mel Swimming in Beaver Lake, Blue, from 2020. In this example, the artist creates a digital trail with her body as she swims in the lake, spelling her name. This mapping of her movements is achieved by her Apple Watch. Unlike other examples presented today, here the landscape is literally mapped and digitally mediated by the movement of the human body. As we have seen throughout the course of this lecture, the portrayal of nature is much more than the copying of a geographical reference. To recall Roger Benjamin, creating landscape is a complex process of imagining. Historically, it has not existed primarily to convey pragmatic information. As we have seen, it has been staged in many ways, creating awe and delight through the centuries. Thank you.
Thank you.